Boa tarde a todos, meu nome é Renan Ferreirinha, estou estudando Economia e Ciências Políticas aqui em Harvard, me formo no final desse ano, sou cofundador do movimento Mapa Educação e faço parte do movimento político Acredito. It's a great pleasure for me today to open this panel. Professor Michael Sandel teaches political philosophy at Harvard University. He has been described as the most relevant living philosopher, or currently the most popular professor in the world by many media outlets. And 18 months ago, I invited him to go to Brazil, and when I was taking one of his classes, and he told me he has been there like 3 times, and he only accepted my offer if he speaks to the mass, to the population. So in 2016, we had the pleasure to have him twice going to Brazil. The first time he spoke at Caldeirão do Huck about leading a debate about Jeitinho Brasileiro, and also had the opportunity to go to Complexo Alemão and other places. And then he spoke at the Supreme Court about public ethics and citizenship, by the invitation of Minister Luís Roberto Barroso. I met Minister Barroso at the first Brazil conference 2 years ago, but we became friends at Oxford last year. Minister Barroso is a professor, jurist, and justice of Brazilian Supreme Court. He has degrees at JD and SGD from the State University of Rio, UERJ, master's degree at Yale, but then he was a visiting professor at Harvard, and we're also very honored to have him here. Professor Sandel and Minister Barroso, thank you for being here. I couldn't imagine about anyone else who could lead us to a debate about Jeitinho Brasileiro and our Brazilian culture. Now I'm going to pass the word to Minister Barroso. Thank you.
I'm going to turn it. Dear Renan Ferreirinha, my dear friends, it's a pleasure and an honor to be here and share with you all some ideas and some reflections on ethics and the Jeitinho Brasileiro. It's also an honor and a pleasure to share this panel with Professor Michael Sandel, who we all admire. We're going to be talking about Brazil, so it's my country. But we're going to do it in English. It's his language. So we're even. When you give a talk in a foreign language, as you probably know by now, you lose a lot of the rhetorical artifices that you can use in your own language. And when this happens, you better have some ideas. And that's where the trouble starts. I begin with a very brief note on aspects of the Brazilian colonization, and then I'll talk very briefly about some dysfunctions that stems from our colonization. And then in the second part of my talk, I will be talking about the different dimensions of the Jeitinho. So here we go. Brazil only truly started in 1808 when the royal family arrived in Rio de Janeiro. Before that, there was no foreign trade because the ports were closed to all nations but Portugal. That's the first thing I would like to highlight. The second thing is Brazil had no roads because Portugal prohibited the construction of any roads. And also, there was no manufacturers. There were no schools, and 98% of the population was illiterate. 1/3 of the population, we are in 1808, was made of slaves. More than that, though, Brazil was not heir to the cultural and political tradition that produced in 1215 the Magna Carta in England. That's the American tradition. Our tradition was the tradition of Portugal, the last country in Europe to end the Inquisition, the last country in Europe to abolish slave trafficking, the last country in history to overcome absolutism. So we started far behind, and we've come a long way to become a relevant mass democracy and one of the 10 major economies in the world. So Brazil was probably one of the most astonishing successes of the 20th century. So I'm starting saying something good because I'm going to make a very harsh, severe appraisal of the current situation of Brazil. But I wouldn't like anyone to think or assume that I am pessimistic, which I'm not. And I don't like pessimism. Pessimism reminds me of a story that I heard from my dear friend Carlos Aires about this guy, Michael, that went to the doctor, and the doctor said, I have bad news for you. And besides that, I have even worse news for you. And the guy goes, well, give me the bad ones first. And he says, you only have 24 hours to live. Oh, God, what could be worse than that? Well, I've been meaning to tell you since yesterday. Well, that's not how I feel about Brazil. We have some good news, too. There are three dysfunctions that I would like to very briefly address that are associated to colonial period. The first one is patrimonialism. This difficulty that we've had throughout history to separate properly the public sphere from the private sphere, and the capture of the state by private interests. This dysfunction, this resigned acceptance of the unacceptable, is expressed in the dictum, steals but get things done. Rouba, mas faz. The second dysfunction I want to stress here is what we can call officialdom. This strong dependence on the state, its blessing, support, and financing, being important and indispensable for anything you want to do in Brazil. From phone companies to carnival customs, everything depends on favors from the state. And this has generated a culture of paternalism that we ought to overcome. We've built a republic of relatives and friends. One of the byproducts of this compulsion in the relation with the state and the improper use of the state can be expressed through this maxim of favoritism and persecution. To my friends, everything. To the enemies, the law. Aos amigos, tudo. Aos inimigos, a lei. And the third chronic dysfunction I would like to point out here is a culture of inequality. The aristocratic regime and the slave regime left a legacy of a society where some people think that there are superiors and inferiors, or that there are some people that are more equal than the others. And in this strange environment, you still can hear here and there the saying, do you know who you're talking to? Sabe com quem você está falando? So this is the background we had to deal when we started becoming a nation and started to face this civilizational process. Then, having said that, and having set the stage, I move on to discuss a little bit about the Jeitinho. Any attempt of a definition of Jeitinho is very dangerous because it's an expression that encompasses too many possible meanings and aspects and implications. But to use its more common conception, I would say Jeitinho is Jeitinho, or little way, or the Brazilian way, whatever, is an informal way of solving problems, employing resources that can vary from the use of charm to the outright corruption, I would say. But in a sense, Jeitinho is an effort to personalize institutional and social relations in order to get a particular rule for oneself, different than the one that would apply to everyone else. And normally embedded in this idea of Jeitinho will be an attempt to create an effective and emotional bond with the interlocutor. So this is an attempt at definition. There is a romantic image of the Jeitinho. And of course, there are some positive features in this way Brazilians are. There are many positive aspects, I would say. We could point out that the way we are, there is a certain lightness of being in the world. It's very typical of a Brazilian, which I think it's a good thing. And we combine affection, good humor, joie de vivre, creativity. So this is the good side of it. And besides, in a very hierarchical and authoritarian society like the Brazilian one, the Jeitinho has become also a way to face the adversities of life in, as I said, an authoritarian country full of inequalities, full of bureaucracies. And so the Jeitinho is kind of a flexible way to find your way around. So there are some good things about the Jeitinho that I do not want to disqualify, and I don't think we should ever lose. But unfortunately, the idea of Jeitinho brings with it also an important array of negative characteristics, things that we need to overcome in order to become actually a developed country in all senses. So in the harsh reality, Jeitinho comes with a list of problems, and I have tried to select a few of them, basically 3 of them, to share with you all. The first negative characteristic of Jeitinho in Brazilian society, I would say, is improvisation, is the inability to plan, to meet deadlines, and ultimately to keep one's word. There is a common misconception in Brazil that everything will be settled at the last minute with a smile and a quick fix. And of course, the blame for the delay that always happens is transferred to some inevitable, though not true, cause or some fatality, when truly the delay is due to imprudence. A very powerful example of this happened in the World Cup. Brazil was elected to host the World Cup in 2007, 7 years before. But when 2014 came, Michael, the stadiums, the airports, the urban interventions, they were not completed. Everything was lacking. So the problem there was not corruption, or not just corruption, but actually this idea that everything's going to be okay with the smile, with the quick fix. And that's a way that Jeitinho becomes mediocrity, I would say. The absence of people capable of competently fulfilling their duties. So this is not a positive trait, of course. So this is the first thing I would like to stress here. Improvisation is a problem. We need to overcome it. The second problem that I would associate with the Jeitinho is the fact that personal feelings and personal relations frequently are above duty and obligations. That's another characteristic that I think we need to face boldly. Personal feelings and relations above duty. And especially in the public sector, you find this in one typical dysfunction, Brazilian dysfunction, which is nepotism. The appointment for public positions or the contracting of services of relatives, of friends, when the Supreme Court in a lawsuit, that I was the lawyer, I was a lawyer at that time. I was happy and I didn't know. At that time, when the court was deciding the case to prohibit nepotism all over the nation, an appellate judge, well-known man, he went to the press and declared, if I don't do it for my loved ones, who will do it? So it was so naturalized that it was part of the natural way of being. But of course, this is not a good way to make a developed country. We need to focus on merits and not in this kind of kinship. And the third feature that I would include in this negative package of Jeitinho is a certain sense of inequality that's still very powerful in Brazil. Maybe if you are in the elite, you don't notice that so much. But it's very present in Brazil. This sense that not everyone is equal and that the rules are meant to the others, to the masses, to the commoners, not to special people like me, which is also something that is ingrained in our culture. And that's the origin of so many privileges. Since we don't have rights for everyone, everyone is seeking privileges. And then I want tax exemptions. I want the privileged forum. I want special prison. So that's a culture that deals with this sense that not everyone is equal. And then it often becomes direct and open violation of the law. First with little scams, like the medical certificate that's not true, or the inflated tax receipt to get reimbursement at the company, or charging different prices if you get an invoice or if you don't get an invoice. And then you move one step up to higher corruption, and then you pay a bribe to get the bid, or to get inside information and make more profits, or maybe a bribe to get the director of the state-owned pension fund to invest money in a not very good investment because he made a kickback. So this is a list, a quick list of some negative aspects of Jeitinho that we need to face. Improvisation, putting personal feelings above duty, this culture of inequality that leads to breaking ethical, social norms, or even the law. And then I move to some current examples of the Brazilian reality. Of course, I'm talking, I have like 20 minutes, 25 minutes, and I'm facing different and complex issues very superficially. There's no way that I could do it differently. But I feel a little bit like the guy that was invited to make an adaptation of War and Peace of Leo Tolstoy to a TV series of 5 chapters. And he said, I don't know if I can translate this joke. He said, I can do it, but I'm going to rename it to Skirmish and Truce. Okay, so some current examples of how these ideas I've been sharing apply to the current reality of Brazil. And I want to address the relationship between Jeitinho and public ethics, and then Jeitinho and private ethics, and then we're done. So Jeitinho, or Little Way, or Brazilian way, I haven't made up my mind if this is something that can be translated. But when I say public ethics, I want to mean the behavior of public agents and also the relationship that individuals, that the citizenship has with the state, with the res publica, with the public sphere. And, well, in this area, we have bad news and a sad story to tell. The truth is that we realized more recently that we created a country that's devastated by corruption. It's very sad to say this, but it's also so true. And as has been said, we're not talking about individual behaviors, small mistakes, accidents. We are talking of something that was institutionalized, and an institutionalized model involving public agents, private companies, political parties, and members of parliament. As I've said before, it's impossible not to be ashamed of what happened in Brazil. That's the sad truth. And I think some features of the Jeitinho contributed to this. One of them is what the Americans call selective vision, looking to the other side, not to see what's happening on the one side. And what happened in Brazil is that we were all surprised by the things we already knew. Or does anyone imagine that a political party wanted to appoint directors to state-owned companies to do good things, to watch for the public interest? No way. This was a predictable tragedy. Even so, we realized, terrified, that all the public sector was contaminated. Talk about the oil company. It has problems. Talk about the Federal Savings Bank, Caixa Econômica Federal. There are problems. Talk about the National Bank for Economic and Social Development. There are problems. Pension funds, problems. Wherever you look, you have main problems. One of the causes of the corruption, I think, as Deltan was referring earlier today, is of course impunity. We have a great difficulty in punishing. Punishment is inconsistent, incompatible with this cordial Brazilian that Sérgio Buarque de Holanda wrote about. And this is a concept we would need to spend some time, which I don't have right now. I need to come to an end. But there is a wonderful song by Chico Buarque called Fado Tropical, in which a Portuguese voice recites a verse in the background. Most of you must have heard of it. It's very difficult to translate. I did make a try. It says, if a harsh sentence is announced, the blind hand must execute it quickly, otherwise the heart will forgive. E se a sentença se anuncia bruta, a mão cega, mais que depressa a executa, pois que senão o coração perdoa. That's how we are, sentimental and lenient. And to end here, there's also the problem with private ethics, with values and purposes and how we relate to the others. And we have problems with public ethics, with private ethics too. And I'm going to end this presentation with these two very brief stories. First one is I was in a social gathering, and a gentleman was saying how terrible corruption was. And then he said he had hired a housekeeper and that she didn't want him to formalize the employment agreement, because if she did so, she would lose the aid that she gets from the government for low-income families, Bolsa Familia. And he was very outraged by that behavior, which was wrong. But then the night goes on, and he tells me the following story. I have a daughter, wonderful, wonderful girl. And she has a life partner, and she has 2 kids. She never married, though, because if she gets married, she loses the pension that her grandfather passed on to her. And he didn't realize the contradiction that was involved in the 2 stories he told me. And that's another problem with private ethics. It's the double moral standard. When I do it, it's fine, it's legitimate. When the others do it, it's not legitimate. And the last one, very briefly, it's not uncommon among well-off people in Brazil that go to parties with lots of people, that they will slip money to the waiters so that they're going to be better served during the party. I've seen it many times. And there's not a perception that this is wrong. And they even feel like they're generous. But truly, there are 2 problems with this behavior. One, people can be bought and bribed to do their job. And second, some people are better than the others, and they deserve to be better served. That's the implicit message in a behavior like this. So, public ethics is to a great extension a mirror of private ethics. So, if we want to make a civilizational leap in Brazil truly, we must start with private ethics, and probably we should start with ourselves. Renan just told me I should, and I'm precise in the time. I read once, Michael, that George Washington made the shortest inauguration speech in the presidency of the United States with 133 words. And that William Henry Harrison made the longest with over 8,000 words pronounced in a very cold and stormy night in Washington, D.C. William Harrison died 30 days later of a terrible pneumonia he caught that night. And I assume that that's the curse that befalls people that talk beyond their time. So I'm finishing with one conclusion that I want to say, not to finish with a positive note. Nothing that I said should be interpreted as any degree of pessimism. Just the opposite. I think we are on the verge of a new time. My main affliction is that we don't waste the chance of making a new country. Making a new country better and bigger. I know that at this current moment, everything seems very difficult. I've been through so many situations in the life of Brazil, in my adult life, that everything seemed impossible. So let me say just this. The military dictatorship seemed invincible. Inflation seemed invincible. Extreme poverty seemed invincible. We have won impossible battles before. Corruption is not invincible. We cannot feel discouraged. And I conclude with the personal slogan that has animated me in good times and in rough times. No matter what's happening around you, do your part the best you can. And be good and correct, even when nobody is watching. Thank you. Thank you. Go ahead. Thank you very much. Thanks for coming. It's a pleasure to have you here. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Appreciate it.
I'll stand here, and then you turn the video on from here?
Yes.
All right.
So you just have to give me a cue whenever you want.
Okay. That I should avoid. You want me to use this one?
And are you going to take questions from your audience?
Yeah. All right, for now. Okay. Well, let me say, first of all, what a privilege it is to be here with Justice Barroso, whom I greatly admire. And that was that short history and contemporary analysis of public and private ethics in Brazil was really a tour de force. The only thing that worries me, Luís, Roberto, is you presented this as a debate. And you've made a powerful case, a stringent moral argument against Jeitinho as a source of public corruption. And that makes me feel as though I'm supposed to defend it. Actually, I'm only beginning to learn about Brazil. I've had the pleasure of visiting 6 times over the last 6 years. And every time I come, it seems I'm beginning to feel as though I bring nothing but trouble. Because I first came when the Mensalão affair was unfolding, and I found that very interesting. And then the next time I came, there were massive street protests prior to the World Cup. And then there were national elections and more street protests. And then another time I came, there was an impeachment going on. And so I'm beginning to think that Brazil should enact a travel ban against me. I liked what your story about the impulse to say, do you know whom you are talking to? And it reminds me of a story, it may be apocryphal, that was said to have occurred here at Harvard some years ago when an exam was taking place in a vast hall. And there were proctors watching to see if anyone cheated on the exam. And they noticed someone was cheating through the entire exam. And at the end, each student came up and handed in his exam, and there was a large pile on the desk of the proctor. And when this student came up, and he was actually the son of a very well-known political family, and the proctor said, "I'm sorry, you have to give me your exam. You were cheating." And he supposedly said, "Do you know who you're talking to?" And the person said, "It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter who you are." He said, "Yes, but do you know who you're talking to?" And the proctor said, "No, I have no idea." So he said, "Good," and he stuck the exam in the middle of the pile. The moral, I was struck, Luís Roberto, by the moral stringency of your analysis of private ethics in Brazil, and I understand that. You love your country, and it pains you to see what seems to be a kind of continuity between lax ethics in private life, sometimes in the name of a kind of charm or lightness of being, as you put it, and its expression in public corruption on a large scale. I wonder if you were so stringent that, well, let me put to you, it's a confessional story, I suppose. Recently, my wife and I were going to Washington, D.C., and there is a magnificent new museum that has just opened there, a museum devoted to African American history in the United States. And we wanted to see it, and it's so popular, it's very difficult to get in. The admission is free, but the only way to get a ticket is to go online that morning at 6:30 a.m. and get a timed ticket. And if you're a minute late, all the tickets are gone. So I thought there must be an easier way. And so I contacted actually a federal judge who was involved in the creation of the museum and wondered whether maybe he had some tickets. And he wrote back to me very apologetically saying that even he was not given such tickets, and the week before he had had to turn down his aunt and uncle who had asked him the same for tickets as well. Now, maybe that, I don't know, would you consider that the ideal, or do you think they should have provided the judge at least some tickets to share with friends and relatives?
Was he at the Supreme Court?
I better not get too specific. Actually, what my exposure, and here I'm really learning, that's why I'm not a very good opponent for this debate. I can't but help be struck by the spirit and the charm of that contributes to the habits and the patterns, the cultural patterns of Jeitinho, even though I am alive, as you've described, to the possibility that the private culture shapes expectations for public life and for the behavior of people in business and in politics. And so really more in the spirit of learning, I'm certainly not equipped to teach or preach Brazilians on this subject, really more in the spirit of learning. During my last visit, I had the opportunity that Hanan was describing of leading a public discussion on the Calderon de Huque program, where he gathered about 15 people from different walks of life throughout Brazil, from lawyers and professors to people who clean the streets, sweep the streets, or who serve as cooks in homes. And we had a discussion. And I put, partly as a way to learn about how people evaluate these practices in everyday life, but also as a way of generating public discussion about the issues that you've raised. We took up a series of scenarios, dilemmas about the ethics of everyday life. For example, if you're going to a bank or a supermarket when it's very crowded and the lines are long, I learned that there are some expedients that people sometimes use, finding either their grandmother or pregnant cousin to come with them as a way, because the lines, there are special lines. Is that how it works?
Yep.
And as a way of getting through the line more quickly. Well, this is the Jeitinho. Is it morally objectionable? That's one question that we discussed. Or produto pirata. Suppose someone wants really very badly to buy a jersey, a Flamengo jersey. They're expensive, the licensed ones, but there are a lot of counterfeit ones that are available. Is it wrong to buy a counterfeit Flamengo jersey? Or is it wrong to sell it? I don't know, we could, I suppose, take a survey of this room. What about that case? How many think that's wrong? Does it make a difference? All right, how many think it's wrong to buy a counterfeit? And how many think it's wrong to sell? They're a little bit, well, it's about the same, actually. The vote is roughly the same here. To me, the most interesting case involved ways of evading the ley seca law. And this involves, and here we'll take a look at a video clip of the discussion. This involves various ways that people avoid the checkpoints, the police checkpoints that are set up to enforce the ley seca law, which has an important purpose to cut down on drinking and driving. And okay. Now, in some, I learned of various expedients that are used. The most straightforward and maybe the easiest to condemn is outright bribery. But a closer call is, what about using mobile apps or Twitter to alert your friends about the location of the ley seca checkpoints, so we can see what some of the debate was.
Professor, muito obrigado. O palco é seu.
Well, thank you, Luciano. Thank you, Helena.
Obrigado, Luciano. Obrigado, Helena, por ter dado início à nossa discussão. Eu sou um filósofo político e vim para o Brasil para tentar entender, com a ajuda de vocês, o que é o jeitinho brasileiro. Como o Luciano disse, essa talvez seja a fonte da corrupção, mas também tem aspectos positivos. Então vamos juntos tentar entender o jeitinho. Vamos começar com um vídeo sobre a lei seca.
No primeiro mês da lei seca, o índice de acidentes diminuiu 26% na cidade, segundo o levantamento do SAMU, o Serviço de Atendimento de Urgência. Mas logo depois, no terceiro mês da lei, o índice de acidentes já tinha voltado ao que era antes.
Eu sei que tem a lei seca, mas a gente vai tentar fazer um caminho alternativo para ver se a gente não pega a lei seca.
Cada um aprendeu a dar o seu jeitinho.
Se a blitz parar, faz que o carro quebrou. Você para, liga o pisco e fala, pô, o carro quebrou.
Tem medo de ser parado na blitz?
Tenho medo, mas conto com a sorte.
Eu sou amiga da Bíblia.
Então, quando está bebendo, você já fica mais atirado, fica mais aceso, com certeza. Bebido igualmente é uma maneira. Eu faço, mas não combino.
How many of you, quantos de vocês, vamos colocar assim, conhecem alguém que tenha feito algo criativo para fugir da lei seca? 6 pessoas, mais ou menos, né? Não, mais. Na internet, os dois. Agora eu queria ouvir de vocês alguns exemplos criativos que as pessoas usam para não serem pegas.
Parar o carro antes da blitz, pedir para alguém que está na rua passar o carro, que esteja sóbrio, que tenha carteira, dá um dinheiro, depois passa.
O meu irmão é pagodeiro, e pagodeiro faz pagode, bebe a noite inteira todo mundo. E aí, meu irmão, pô, fulano, você vai para tal lugar, não passa por ali porque tem lei seca. Não passa por ali não. Então cada um pega o seu sobremazinho, um liga pro outro e dá a dica.
Tenho um amigo, ele é médico, ele sabe que algumas doenças, tem alguns remédios que tem na composição álcool, e ele andava com uma receita, tinha esse medicamento, e tinha um pouco de álcool, não é meu remédio.
O que nós percebemos muito é que a população usa as redes sociais. A ferramenta mais útil, mais acessível para todos é a ferramenta a rede social para avisar, para proteger o companheiro para não passar ali cedo.
Alright, let's see o que será que as pessoas aqui pensam disso? É errado, é falta de ética. Usar um aplicativo ou uma rede social para alertar as pessoas sobre onde está a Blitz? Quantos acham que é errado?
Raise your hand.
Quantos acham que não é errado?
Isso é bom.
Tony, você acha que não é errado usar as redes sociais? Por quê?
Eu acho que as redes sociais elas são um espaço de liberdade. Eu acho que você não pode querer controlar o que é dito lá. O que eu acho errado é a pessoa beber e dirigir. Todo mundo tem liberdade de falar o que quiser, porém, a gente tem que ter a noção de que a lei precisa ser respeitada. E por que ela precisa ser respeitada? Porque a lei, ela está preservando o bem coletivo. E no Brasil, por causa desse jeitinho brasileiro, a gente sempre acha que a vantagem individual vale mais em detrimento do bem-estar coletivo.
Não é uma preocupação de controlar a rede social, não é essa a preocupação. É apenas que evite a pessoa, iniciativa própria, de utilizar a rede social para avisar onde que está a Blitz.
E, professor, muito obrigado. O palco é seu.
Well, thank you, Luciano. Thank you.
I think that's enough. Okay. Well, this gives you just the flavor of some of the debate, some of the discussion and my impression by the end was that most of the participants, Luís, Roberto, did see a connection between Jeitinho and the massive corruption against which so many in the country are protesting, and which, thanks to an independent judiciary, and there now seems to be some real progress. So I want to leave time for some discussion. I would like to put some questions to you and also to have the audience join in. So I would really just end by posing two broad questions that are raised by the discussion with this group on Luciano's show, and also questions that occurred to me listening to your talk. There seems to be tremendous public outrage in Brazil, and rightly so, against the massive corruption at the highest levels. And yet, there seems not to be a very strong or explicit connection drawn when people are outraged against politicians, leading them to reflect on whether the ethics of the decisions they make in everyday life, the conduct they engage in, as you've described it, how close is what is the level of awareness, self-conscious awareness, among Brazilians of a possible connection between the public corruption they decry and the practices of Jeitinho, which, to varying degrees, amount to a kind of micro-corruption of everyday life? That's one question. And the second question is, you've called for trying to disabuse Brazilian social and cultural life of these habits, the Jeitinho habits that lean toward a kind of corruption, the personalization of public relations and so on. That makes me wonder, when the Lava Jato investigations and persecutions have been complete, and, as we hope, successful. Will that fact by itself lead to a new kind of public culture? Or will it be seen simply as a public event to do with politicians and business people that has no bearing and leads to no reconsideration of the micro-corruptions of everyday life that you've identified? And if it won't happen by itself, what might possibly connect them? It seems to me a possible answer to that question depends on generating public discussion and deliberation and reflection about politics, but also about the ethics of everyday life. This, at least, was the ambition that, in a very small way, that lay behind the public discussion that we just showed a sample of. But my question for you and for the group, and you're all better equipped to answer this question certainly than I am, is what agencies of civil society and of public deliberation could possibly enable democratic citizens to critically reflect on the possible connection between public and private ethics?
Thank you. Falo 3 minutinhos e depois a gente ouve a plateia? O que você acha melhor?
Pode ser um pouquinho mais rápido. Pode ser 1, 2 minutos?
2 minutos. Yeah, I'll just very briefly comment the 3 examples you gave. The first one about getting the pregnant woman or the senior citizen to the line, I think that would be unacceptable. I think the golden rule is here to see if the Jeitinho is legitimate or not. Does it harm someone else or the social group or the state when the state is defending a legitimate interest? And clearly it does in this case. So I would straightforward reject this possibility here. The third one about the lei seca, here there's one thing that you must understand being an American. In authoritarian societies, the state is often perceived as the enemy. So things that you do to help people avoid getting caught by the states are acceptable. But of course, in a democracy, this pattern of behavior must change. So I would say this is wrong, but I don't like to be hypocritical. If a good friend of mine knew that and didn't call me, I would get very upset. So, and the third one is...
Wait. And would you do the same for him?
Yeah, there is one thing that...
Would you send him a Twitter alert?
I can't answer this. I don't answer questions when I can't be totally honest.
In that case, you've just answered it.
And the third one, you asked about the jersey, the Flamengo jersey, that of course everyone would be proud to wear. You made that question in an audience where everyone can afford it. So that question would be more complicated in a different environment.
I was going to point that out, but I thought I would leave that to you to point out.
Yeah. Okay, so Hannah, let's have the people and I'll go back to the...
Yeah. Perfect. So we're short on time, so we're going to have 2 questions, okay? If you want to ask a question, Gabriel, and we're going to take one of each side, all right? So let's have the one here, and now a girl to balance. So a woman there. Yeah, so you and you. Sounds good?
Okay.
You can go ahead.
Okay. Minister, we are a little bit concerned about the Supreme Court nominations. Especially recently, we have noticed that Alexandre Moraes, the Supreme Court minister, was elected, and he was in both parties, in negotiating votes for his nomination with politicians. Those are under federal investigation. It's a kind of Jeitinho. How can we deal with that? We are in the... Okay.
Thank you.
Well, there's no wrong question, but there are wrong answers. So I'll be very careful here, but I can answer you. First of all, Moraes is a trained lawyer. He has a master's degree, and he has an SJD, and he's a law professor. So we're not talking about someone that's unprepared. That's the first thing I want to say. But the second important thing is, at the moment that the Supreme Court became politically important, it was totally predictable that politics would hit back. And he is a man that comes from politics, and that's true. There is nothing wrong with that, though, if politics stay outside of the court, as probably will happen.
All right, so you can go.
Good afternoon. My name is Natalia. I'm a visiting student at Harvard College, and I have a question about evading lei seca. Many Brazilians feel like they don't agree with this law, and they think they are engaging in some kind of civil disobedience when they do so. So is that morally relevant, and what does that change? Thank you.
It's for you.
Well, civil disobedience, traditionally, civil disobedience involves protesting an unjust law by violating it and by accepting the legal consequences. And most of the examples that we saw here of the use of ways of evading the lei seca law do not involve that. So that would make a moral difference. When Martin Luther King led sit-ins and marches and was willing to be arrested and taken to jail, it had a moral weight, because he and those who were with him were prepared to make the sacrifice as a way of addressing the conscience of the country. That's civil disobedience. Had they simply broken the law and then run away, it wouldn't have had that moral weight. So I think that's worth bearing in mind in distinguishing evading a law that you don't agree with and engaging in a principled act of civil disobedience.
Michael, and the question kind of reveals one problem with the Jeitinho, which is a bad relationship with laws in general, and you can pick the ones you want to abide by and the ones you don't. But by the way, I support the law. I think it's very positive and it saved many lives. And there's one rule in my house for my kids: don't drink and drive. And that's the only thing that's absolute.
All right, thank you so much, Professor Sandel. Thanks so much, Minister Barroso.